In the United States, we take a lot of pride in our long tradition of democracy. However, few of us ever consider where our political system comes from. The ideas that forged our nation and helped build a constitution that's lasted for over 200 years, those ideas had to have come from somewhere. The land that would become the United States was populated by colonists from all over the world. There was an amazing amount of diversity in the United States at its founding. However, the bulk of colonists, especially in the early years, came from the British Isles. So it stands to reason that England must have had an influence on our early government. Often, Americans fail to realize that many democratic principles were well established in England long before there was a Declaration of Independence or a Constitution of the United States. Although not as democratic as today, England had a representative parliament beginning in the 13th century, and their people enjoyed rights and protections guaranteed to them through common law, which was essentially a legal system based on hundreds of years of court decisions. So when English colonists began to travel to the New World and create their own governments, they brought these traditions with them, two of the most important being limited government and popular sovereignty, or the idea that political power rests with the people. These ideas have their origin in three historic English documents: the Magna Carta, the Petition of Right, and the English Bill of Rights, together making sort of an unwritten English constitution. King John I, pictured here, signed the Magna Carta in 1215. It was not an act of royal generosity. The knights in this picture, armed and in full armor, give us a clue as to what kind of pressure John was under. Some quick background. John, King of England, was obsessed with recapturing land deep into France that had at one point been controlled by his father. He spent a huge amount of English resources on these exploits. King John levied heavy taxes on his barons in order to finance his wars, only to suffer military failure after military failure. When he returned to England, the barons, or the English nobility, were primed for rebellion. The result was the Magna Carta. It did not make sweeping statements about the freedom of men, but rather dealt with very specific concerns about royal abuses. It made the bold claim that even the king could not infringe upon common law rights such as trial by jury or due process of law. The barons were looking out for themselves, but in the process they set limits on royal power, for the first time challenging the concept of absolute rule in writing. Centuries later, its words would not just evoke limited government, but also universal rights. One word has particular importance. At the time, very few free men existed outside of the nobility. By the end of the 16th century, however, feudalism had broken down in England, and all of the king's subjects were free. Unfortunately, nearly 400 years separate the Magna Carta from the end of serfdom. And even though it laid the foundation for a parliament, it becomes mostly irrelevant during this time. A series of strong monarchs kept Parliament in check, and the Magna Carta sat mostly forgotten. It didn't even receive a mention in Shakespeare's play about King John. Not until the 17th century under Charles I does the crown face another meaningful challenge to its authority. Again, the conflict was over money for war. Parliament responded by issuing the Petition of Right in 1628, which affirmed the principle of no taxation without parliamentary consent. Sound familiar? And it established the rule of law, meaning that even the king must follow the letter of the law. Later in the century, in what became known as the Glorious Revolution, Parliament disposed of James II and invited William of Orange and Mary to take the throne. Parliament looked for a precedent to justify what they had done. They ended up turning to the long-neglected Magna Carta and claimed that the right to rule came from consent of the governed, first given in 1215, and now codified by the English Bill of Rights in 1689. This line of reasoning sounded less like precedent set in the Magna Carta and much more like the writing of political philosopher John Locke, somebody we're going to be looking at later in the year. The fact that the Magna Carta was resurrected 473 years later to support a fairly radical idea about sovereignty represents something much more significant. In 1215, Englishmen unknowingly began a process of democratization that lasted over the next 5 centuries. That process continued for English colonists that traveled to North America. They took with them ideas of representative government and free elections, as well as rights they held dear, like right of petition and guarantee of trial by jury. These ideas intersected with new ones, such as freedom of religion from the French Enlightenment. American democracy as a whole was unique, but its individual ideas were not. And the influence of English tradition on American colonists cannot be ignored.